At 6:15 on the morning of March 3, 1943, Captain Paul Irving Gunn stood on the flight line at Port Moresby, watching 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers taxi toward the runway. His hands were black with grease. His flight suit smelled of hydraulic fluid and cigarette smoke. He had not slept in 36 hours. Those 12 bombers looked nothing like the aircraft that had rolled off the assembly line in California. Their glass noses were gone, replaced with solid metal plates bristling with 450 caliber machine guns. 4 more guns jutted from blisters mounted on each side of the fuselage, 2 per side. 8 forward-firing guns on each aircraft. The pilots called them commerce destroyers. The brass called them strafers. Everyone else called them Pappy Gunn's folly. In the next 4 hours, those 12 aircraft would prove every skeptic wrong. They would sink more Japanese ships in a single engagement than the entire Pacific Fleet had managed in months. They would change the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. And they would transform an underperforming medium bomber into the most heavily armed aircraft in the American arsenal. But Paul Gunn was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his wife, Polly, and their 4 children, trapped in a Japanese internment camp in Manila, 1,500 miles to the north. He was thinking about how every Japanese ship he helped destroy brought him one day closer to seeing them again. What happened over the Bismarck Sea that morning would vindicate everything Gunn had fought for. But the story of how a 43-year-old former Navy chief transformed American air power begins 8 months earlier, in the wreckage of a disaster. When Major General George Kenney arrived in Australia in late July 1942, he found an air force in shambles. General Douglas MacArthur had just fired his previous air commander for incompetence. The 5th Air Force had fewer than 200 operational aircraft scattered across bases from Brisbane to Port Moresby. Japanese forces controlled the skies over New Guinea. American bombers were being shot down faster than they could be replaced. MacArthur summoned Kenney to his headquarters in Brisbane and delivered what Kenney later described as a 2-hour lecture on everything wrong with his air force. The bombers could not hit anything. The fighters could not protect them. The maintenance crews could not keep aircraft flying. MacArthur wanted results, and he wanted them immediately. Kenney listened without interrupting. When MacArthur finished, Kenney made him a promise. "Give me authority to run air operations my way, and I will deliver. If I cannot make it work, I will tell you myself and request my own relief." MacArthur agreed. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape the Pacific War. Kenney's first task was understanding why his bombers were failing. The answer became clear within days. American doctrine called for medium bombers, like the B-25, to attack from 10 to 12,000 feet, dropping their bombs on enemy ships and installations from relative safety. The problem was that bombs dropped from that altitude almost never hit anything. Japanese vessels simply watched the bombs fall and maneuvered out of the way. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns were devastating the bomber formations. The B-25 had been designed as a level bomber, not a combat aircraft. Its defensive armament was pitiful: a single 30 caliber machine gun in the nose, 2 50 caliber guns in a dorsal turret, a retractable belly turret that took nearly a minute to deploy and made the gunner violently airsick. The waist gunner had to physically move a single gun from one side of the aircraft to the other. Kenney watched mission after mission return with empty bomb bays and bullet holes. His crews were brave, but bravery was not enough. They needed a different approach entirely. The answer came from an unlikely source. A few days after taking command, Kenney visited the 3rd Bomb Group at Charters Towers in Queensland. There he found a middle-aged captain with a cigar clamped between his teeth, crawling inside the nose of a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber with a welding torch. The captain's name was Paul Irving Gunn. Everyone called him Pappy. Gunn was not supposed to be there. He was not even supposed to be in the army. Before the war, he had spent 21 years as an enlisted naval aviator, retiring as a chief petty officer in 1939. He had moved his family to the Philippines and started Philippine Airlines, one of the first commercial airlines in Asia. When the Japanese attacked in December 1941, the army drafted him as a transport pilot. Gunn had flown reconnaissance missions over Bataan and Corregidor. He had been shot down twice and survived both crashes. He had evacuated key personnel to Australia in the final desperate days before Manila fell, but his wife Polly and their 4 children, 2 sons named Paul and Nathan, and 2 daughters named Connie and Julie, had not escaped. They were captured by the Japanese and interned at Santo Tomas University in Manila. From that moment forward, Paul Gunn fought the war with a single consuming purpose. Every mission, every modification, every hour of work brought him closer to liberating his family. He did not care about regulations or protocols or chain of command. He cared about killing Japanese and getting to Manila. The other men in the theatre noticed something different about Gunn. Most soldiers wanted to survive. They wanted to do their duty and go home. Gunn wanted to destroy. He took risks that experienced pilots considered suicidal. He volunteered for missions that no one else would fly. He worked around the clock, sometimes going days without sleep, driven by a fury that burned hotter than any engine he maintained. His age should have kept him grounded. At 43, he was old enough to be the father of most pilots in the theatre. The nickname Pappy was not just a term of affection. It described reality. But Gunn flew combat missions alongside men half his age, and he flew them with a ferocity that younger pilots struggled to match. He was wounded 9 times, 9 Purple Hearts. Each time he recovered and went back to flying. His body bore the scars of shrapnel, burns, and crash landings. None of it slowed him down. The only thing that mattered was his family in Manila, and every Japanese soldier, or sailor, or pilot he killed brought him closer to seeing them again. When Kenny found him at Charters Towers, Gunn was installing 50-caliber machine guns salvaged from wrecked P-40 fighters into the nose of the A-20. His reasoning was simple. If bombers could not hit anything from high altitude, they would have to attack at low level. If they attacked at low level, they needed forward-firing guns to suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire. The A-20's nose was designed for a bombardier who would be useless in a low-level attack. Why not fill it with guns instead? Kenny watched Gunn work for several minutes without speaking. Then he asked a single question. "Can you do the same thing to the B-25? Gunn looked up from his welding. He had been waiting for someone to ask. The B-25 Mitchell was a bigger aircraft than the A-20, with longer range and heavier payload capacity. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs over 1,000 miles and return, but it had the same fundamental problem. Its nose was designed for a bombardier sitting behind a plexiglass greenhouse, not for offensive firepower. Gunn proposed a radical solution. Remove the bombardier entirely. Replace the glass nose with a solid metal fairing packed with 50-caliber machine guns. Add more guns in external blisters on the sides of the fuselage. Turn the medium bomber into a flying arsenal that could strafe its way through enemy defences at masthead height. The concept was not entirely new. The British had experimented with forward-firing guns on their Beaufighters. The Germans had armed their Junkers 88s with heavy cannons for ground attack, but no one had attempted anything on the scale Gunn envisioned. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing forward simultaneously. Combined with skip bombing, it would create an entirely new form of aerial warfare. Skip bombing itself was still experimental. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bomb Squadron had pioneered the technique using B-17 flying fortresses in late 1942. The concept was simple in theory. Fly low and fast toward a ship. Release your bombs at a shallow angle a few hundred feet from the target. The bombs would skip across the water like flat stones, slam into the side of the vessel at the waterline, and detonate inside the hull. A direct hit below the waterline was far more damaging than a bomb striking the deck from above, but skip bombing with B-17s was awkward and dangerous. The big 4-engine bombers were too slow, too ungainly, too vulnerable at low altitude. The technique demanded a faster, more maneuverable aircraft. The B-25 was perfect for the role, but only if it could suppress the anti-aircraft fire that would otherwise tear it apart during the approach. That was where the forward-firing guns came in, strafe the ship's deck during the approach, kill the gunners before they could aim their weapons, then drop the skip bombs into the defenseless hull. It was elegant in its brutality. North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, said it was impossible. The aircraft was not designed for that kind of stress. The weight and balance would be completely wrong. The recoil from that many guns firing simultaneously would shake the airframe apart. Gunn did not care what North Americans said. He had spent 20 years maintaining Navy aircraft in conditions the factory engineers could not imagine. He knew what worked and what did not, and he had a partner who shared his vision. Jack Fox was North American Aviation's field service representative in Australia. His job was to help maintain the B-25s and report problems back to the factory. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator. Fox understood the aircraft's engineering. Gunn understood what it needed to do in combat. Together, they would rebuild the B-25 from the nose back. Their first prototype was a B-25C with serial number 1-12437. They called it Pappy's Folly. Gunn and Fox worked in a maintenance hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. They stripped out the bombardier's position and installed 450 caliber Browning machine guns behind a metal plate that replaced the glass nose. Each gun carried 500 rounds of ammunition. They added 4 more guns in external blisters, 2 on each side of the fuselage below the cockpit. The blisters were fabricated from sheet metal salvaged from wrecked aircraft. The work took weeks. Gunn pulled parts from every source he could find, guns from crashed fighters, ammunition from supply depots, sheet metal and welding rod from wherever he could beg, borrow, or steal. There are stories, never officially confirmed, that Gunn once threatened a Dutch supply officer with a Thompson submachine gun to obtain gun sights that had been allocated to another unit. When the prototype was finished, it bristled with 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. The pilot could unleash all 8 simultaneously, pouring over 6,000 rounds per minute into a target directly ahead. No bomber in any air force had ever carried that kind of forward firepower. The first test flight nearly ended in disaster. The weight of the guns and ammunition had shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. The B-25 wanted to nose over on takeoff. Gunn and Fox spent another week adjusting the installation, moving the guns further aft, redistributing ammunition storage. The second test flight went smoothly. Then came the firing tests. Gunn took the aircraft up himself and dove on a target range at 200 miles per hour. He pressed the trigger on the control yoke. All 8 guns roared simultaneously. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke filled the cockpit. Spent brass casings ricocheted everywhere. The recoil was tremendous. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns each produced over 100 pounds of rearward force when firing. Combined, they were pushing back with more than 800 pounds of thrust. The aircraft actually slowed in the air when all guns fired simultaneously. Pilots learned to compensate by adding power during strafing runs. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening. The vibration shook instruments loose from their mounts. The smell of cordite and hot gun oil permeated everything. Pilots came back from test flights with ringing ears and trembling hands. But the airframe held. The guns tracked true, and the target was shredded beyond recognition. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was the perfect weapon for this application. It fired armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds at over 2,800 feet per second. The bullets could penetrate 20 millimeters of armor plate at 500 yards. Against unarmored ship hulls and deck structures, they were devastating. Against human beings caught in the open, they were unsurvivable. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,400 rounds per minute directed at a single point. A 3-second burst put over 300 heavy-caliber rounds into the target. Nothing built by human hands could absorb that kind of punishment and remain functional. General Kenny flew out to witness the next test. He watched Gunn make 3 firing passes on a derelict ship in the harbour. Every pass walked a stream of tracers across the deck. By the 3rd pass, the ship's superstructure was in flames. Kenny had seen enough. He ordered Gunn to modify every B-25 he could get his hands on. The conversion program expanded rapidly. What began as a single prototype became an industrial operation. Gunn established modification centres at Eagle Farm near Brisbane and later at Townsville in Queensland. Teams of mechanics worked around the clock converting standard B-25s into strafers. The work was painstaking. Each aircraft required dozens of hours of labour. The bombardier's station had to be stripped out entirely. New mounting brackets had to be fabricated and welded in place. Electrical systems had to be rewired to connect the guns to the pilot's controls. Ammunition feeds had to be installed. The whole nose section had to be reinforced to handle the recoil loads. Finding parts was a constant challenge. The 50 caliber Browning machine guns came from crashed fighters. Gunn sent teams to scour every wreck they could find, salvaging guns, ammunition, belts, feed mechanisms, anything that could be used. When official channels failed, Gunn improvised. He became infamous for requisitioning parts without authorization, for pressuring supply officers who refused to cooperate, for acquiring materials through channels that were not entirely within regulations. By late February 1943, 12 B-25s had been converted to strafers at the Modification Centre in Townsville. They were assigned to the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group, commanded by Major Edward Larner. Larner was a bold pilot who had transferred from the States specifically to fly the new gunships. He drilled his crews relentlessly, practicing low-level attacks on wrecked ships in the harbour at Port Moresby. The pilots called the training terrifying, flying at 200 feet above the water, releasing bombs that skipped across the surface like flat stones, pulling up at the last possible moment to avoid the masts of the target vessel. A single mistake meant death. There was no margin for error at that altitude, but Larner believed in the concept. If the strafers could get in close, if they could suppress the anti-aircraft guns with their forward-firing weapons, they could put bombs directly into the sides of enemy ships. No more dropping from altitude and hoping. No more watching bombs splash harmlessly into the sea. Direct hits, every time. The opportunity to prove the concept came sooner than anyone expected. On February 28, 1943, a Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on New Britain Island, bound for Lae on the coast of New Guinea. The convoy carried nearly 7,000 troops of the 51st Infantry Division, along with ammunition, supplies, and fuel. 8 transport ships, escorted by 8 destroyers. If those reinforcements reached Lae, they would pose a serious threat to Allied positions throughout New Guinea. The stakes could not have been higher. Japan had been on the offensive since Pearl Harbor. They had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, Burma, and most of the Pacific Islands. In New Guinea, they had pushed within 30 miles of Port Moresby before being stopped at the Kokoda, Track, and Buna. If the 51st Division reached Lae, they would threaten to resume that advance. Allied intelligence had broken the Japanese codes. Kenny knew the convoy was coming. He knew its route. He knew its destination. He planned to destroy it. The attack would be the largest coordinated air operation the 5th Air Force had ever attempted. Heavy bombers would soften the convoy from altitude. Medium bombers and Beaufighters would attack at masthead level. Fighters would provide top cover and strafe survivors. Every available aircraft would participate. The first attacks came on March 2nd as the convoy passed through the Bismarck Sea. High-altitude bombers hit the convoy throughout the day, sinking one transport and damaging several others. But the results were disappointing. Hundreds of bombs had been dropped. Only a handful had found their marks. The remaining ships pressed on toward Lae. They would arrive the following morning unless something stopped them. That something was the strafers. At dawn on March 3rd, Major Larner led his 12 modified B-25s out of Port Moresby. They were joined by A-20 Havocs from the 89th Bomb Squadron and Bristol Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force. P-38 Lightning fighters flew top cover. The entire strike force numbered over 100 aircraft. The convoy was located at 9:15, 60 miles southeast of Finschhafen. 7 transports and 4 destroyers remained afloat, clustered together for mutual protection. Japanese Zero fighters circled overhead. The high-altitude bombers attacked first, forcing the ships to scatter and dividing the attention of the anti-aircraft gunners. Then came the Beaufighters, raking the convoy at masthead height with their 20mm cannons. The Japanese sailors were still recovering when Larner's strafers arrived. What happened next changed naval warfare forever. The 12 B-25s came in at 200 feet, engines screaming, 8 guns blazing from each aircraft. The combined firepower was staggering, 96 50 caliber machine guns tearing into the convoy simultaneously, over 45,000 rounds per minute sweeping across the decks of the Japanese ships. Major Larner led the first element of 4 aircraft toward a large transport. As he approached, he keyed his radio. His wingmen were following too close. "Get the hell off my wing and get your own boat," he shouted. Each pilot needed to pick a separate target. Concentrating on single ships would waste their combined firepower. The pilots spread out, each selecting a different vessel. Lana aimed for a destroyer, its anti-aircraft guns already firing at the incoming aircraft. He pressed the trigger. Tracers reached out from his nose, walking across the water, climbing the hull, raking the deck. The anti-aircraft guns fell silent as their crews were cut down. Behind him, Captain John Hennebury watched Lana make his run. Everybody was rather apprehensive, Hennebury recalled later. When everybody saw him make that pass and hit it with at least one, and maybe two, the explosion, and so, that just ignited the whole thing. The guys got the idea if he could do it, they could do it. The anti-aircraft gunners never had a chance. Before they could track the incoming aircraft, they were dead or diving for cover. The strafers came so fast and so low that the Japanese could not depress their guns far enough to engage them. Naval anti-aircraft weapons were designed to track aircraft flying overhead, not aircraft flying at masthead level directly toward the ship. Then came the bombs. Each B-25 carried 4 500-pound bombs equipped with delayed fuses. The pilots released them at 200 feet, skipping them across the water like stones on a pond. The bombs bounced once, twice, 3 times, then slammed into the sides of the transport ships at the waterline. The delayed fuses gave the aircraft time to clear the target before detonation. In the first 15 minutes, the strafers scored 17 direct hits on 7 ships. 4 transports were sinking, 2 destroyers were burning. The convoy had ceased to exist as an organized force. Lana led his pilots back for a second pass, then a third. By 10:30, every transport in the convoy had been hit. Fires burned across the sea. Ships rolled over and sank. Thousands of Japanese soldiers who had been sleeping in their bunks were now drowning or burning or being strafed in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the debut of the B-25 strafer, and it was a massacre. Over the next 2 days, Allied aircraft returned again and again to finish off the crippled convoy and attack the survivors. By the time the battle ended on March 5th, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who had embarked at Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The rest, approximately 3,000 men, were killed. American losses were 13 aircrew killed or missing. 4 aircraft shot down in combat. 2 crashed in accidents. The ratio was unprecedented. Nothing like it had been seen in naval warfare since the age of sail. News of the victory electrified the Allied command. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. General Kenny sent a message to his pilots. Air Power has written some important history in the past 3 days. Tell the whole gang that I am so proud of them I am about to blow a fuse. But the Japanese noticed something else. Something that terrified them. Japanese pilots who survived the battle reported that the American bombers had attacked with unprecedented aggression. They flew lower than any bombers the Japanese had ever seen, so low that their propellers kicked up spray from the waves. They absorbed anti-aircraft fire that should have knocked them out of the sky and kept coming, and their forward firepower was devastating. The guns never stopped firing from the moment they began their attack runs until they were climbing away over the burning ships. The traditional Japanese defense against air attack had been optimized over years of combat. Ships would turn bow on to torpedo bombers, presenting the smallest possible target. Anti-aircraft gunners would track incoming aircraft and lead them appropriately. Fighter cover would intercept before the bombers could release their weapons. These tactics had worked against everything the Allies had thrown at them for the first year of the war. Against the strafers, none of it worked. Turning bow on did nothing against aircraft that were strafing rather than dropping torpedoes. The anti-aircraft guns could not track targets moving that fast at that angle. The fighters could not engage bombers flying at treetop level without risking collision with the water or the ships themselves. Japanese naval commanders conducted a formal assessment. Their conclusion was grim. The Americans had developed a new type of aircraft, a bomber that could fight like a fighter. The traditional tactics for defending convoys against air attack no longer worked. Any attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea would end the same way. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had commanded the convoy escort, reported to his superiors that the American air attack was unlike anything in Japanese experience. The combination of strafing and skip bombing had proven devastatingly effective. He recommended that no more troop convoys be sent to eastern New Guinea without overwhelming air superiority. Staff Officer Masatake Okumiya was more blunt. "Our losses for this single battle were fantastic," he wrote. "Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea, east of Wewak." On March 25, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued a directive. There would be no more attempts to land troops at Lae. All reinforcements would be sent to Wewak or Hansa Bay, far to the west, beyond the range of the new American strafers. The Japanese expansion in New Guinea had been stopped, and it was only the beginning. After the Bismarck Sea, demand for strafer conversions exploded. Every B-25 squadron in the Pacific wanted the modification. Kenny established conversion centres at Townsville and Brisbane, then expanded operations to handle the volume. By the summer of 1943, more than 60 B-25s had been converted to strafers. By the end of the year, the number exceeded 200. Pappy Gunn did not rest. Even as his original design was being replicated across the theatre, he was working on improvements: more guns, better ammunition feeds, auxiliary fuel tanks to extend range, camera mounts in the tail to document attacks. Each modification made the strafers more lethal. In August 1943, the strafers proved their worth again at Wewak. The Japanese 4th Air Army had concentrated nearly 200 aircraft at 4 airfields around Wewak, preparing for a major offensive. Kenny decided to destroy them on the ground. The problem was range. Wewak was over 500 miles from Port Moresby, beyond the escort range of American fighters. Heavy bombers could reach Wewak, but without fighter protection they would be vulnerable to Japanese interceptors. Kenny needed to find a way to get his fighters closer to the target. He found the solution in an abandoned pre-war airstrip near the village of Marilinan, high in the Owen Stanley Mountains, about 300 miles south of Wewak. Australian infantry secured the area, while American engineers rushed to make the strip operational. The work was done in secret. Japanese reconnaissance never detected the activity. Meanwhile, Kenny ordered a brilliant deception. Construction crews built dummy airfields at Bena Bena and other locations, raising large clouds of dust to make it appear major bases were being constructed. Japanese bombers attacked these fake airfields repeatedly. Convinced they were preventing Allied occupation, the real base at Marilinan remained undetected. On the night of August 16th, 50 B-17s and B-24s bombed the Wewak airfields from high altitude. The Japanese were caught off guard but scrambled fighters to intercept. Several bombers were damaged, but the raid accomplished its primary purpose. It alerted the Japanese that an attack was underway and prompted them to prepare their aircraft for immediate takeoff the following morning. The attack on August 17th caught the Japanese completely by surprise. B-25 strafers came in at treetop level from a direction the Japanese had not anticipated, their guns blazing, strafing aircraft lined up on the runways with their engines running and pilots aboard. The Japanese were waiting to take off when the Americans arrived. They never got the chance. The scene was everything a strafer pilot dreamed of. 60 Japanese bombers lined up on either side of the runway, engines warm, crews aboard, ready for takeoff. The B-25 swept across the field at 200 miles per hour, 8 guns per aircraft pouring fire into the parked bombers. Aircraft exploded, fuel tanks detonated. Pilots died in their cockpits before they could even begin their takeoff rolls. Over 5 days, the 5th Air Force destroyed more than 170 Japanese aircraft. The 4th Air Army was reduced to an operational strength of about 30 planes. Japanese air power in New Guinea never recovered. Meanwhile, North American aviation had finally acknowledged what Gunn had proven in combat. The strafer configuration worked. The company began incorporating variations of Gunn's modifications into production aircraft. The B-25G model added a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose alongside 2 machine guns. The B-25H carried 4 nose guns plus 4 in blister packages plus a lighter T-13E1 cannon that reduced the punishing recoil. 14 forward, firing weapons on a single aircraft. The 75mm cannon was a bold experiment. It was essentially an M4 tank gun, adapted for aircraft use. The barrel extended 9.5 feet through the nose of the aircraft, with the breech mechanism extending under the pilot's seat. The navigator, sitting behind the pilot, loaded the 15-pound shells by hand. The cannon could penetrate the armor of any ship afloat. A direct hit would open a hole in a destroyer's hull large enough to walk through. Against transport ships and barges, it was overkill. One round would often sink a small vessel outright, but the cannon had serious limitations. It could only fire about 4 rounds during a single attack pass. Loading was slow and difficult, especially in a pitching, rolling aircraft. The recoil was punishing. When the cannon fired, the entire aircraft shuddered as if it had hit a wall. Pilots reported that instruments shook loose from their mounts. The compass deviation could reach 15 degrees. Most significantly, the cannon required a steady approach to aim accurately. The pilot had to fly straight and level toward the target, giving anti-aircraft gunners a perfect opportunity to track and engage. Many crews found the cannon more trouble than it was worth. They preferred the machine guns, which allowed them to maintain evasive maneuvering throughout the attack. Despite these limitations, the cannon-armed B-25s saw extensive service. They proved effective against hardened targets like bunkers and bridge abutments. Against shipping, they could disable an enemy vessel's fire control systems with a single well-placed round, allowing follow-up aircraft to skip-bomb the defenseless hulk. But the ultimate expression of Gunn's vision came with the B-25J model, which entered production in late 1943. The solid-nose version of the J carried 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, 4 in blister packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the waist, and 2 in the tail. 18 machine guns total, 8 of them pointed forward. It was the most heavily armed aircraft in the American inventory. A single 12-plane squadron of B-25J strafers carried more 50 caliber machine guns than 4 infantry regiments. Their combined firepower could put over 100,000 rounds per minute into a target area. Nothing that floated or flew or crawled could survive that concentration of destruction. The Japanese called them flying machine gun nests. American crews called them executioners. Both names were accurate. By 1944, strafer operations had evolved into a precisely choreographed form of destruction. The aircraft attacked in waves. The first wave suppressed anti-aircraft fire. The second wave dropped parachute fragmentation bombs on personnel and equipment. The third wave skip bombed hardened targets. The fourth wave strafed survivors. Each wave prepared the target for the next. The parachute fragmentation bombs, called parafrags, were another innovation perfected by Gunn and Kenny. Standard bombs released at low altitude would bounce back up and destroy the aircraft that dropped them. The parachute slowed the bomb's descent just enough for the aircraft to clear the blast radius. When the bombs hit, they scattered fragments over a wide area, shredding personnel and soft targets. Against airfields, the parafrags were devastating. A single B-25 could carry over 100 of the small bombs. A 12-plane formation could blanket an entire airfield with thousands of fragments, killing maintenance crews, puncturing fuel drums, shredding canvas tents, and damaging parked aircraft beyond repair. The technique proved devastating against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. Airfields, harbors, supply dumps, troop concentrations, coastal shipping. Everything was vulnerable to the strafers. The Japanese could not move men or material by daylight without risking destruction. They were forced into traveling only at night, which slowed their operations to a crawl and made coordination nearly impossible. Japanese troops learned to dread the distinctive sound of approaching B-25s. The roar of the Wright Cyclone engines at full power, the howl of propellers biting into thick tropical air, the sudden eruption of machine gun fire. Men dove into foxholes and ditches, praying the guns would not find them. Those who hesitated died. At Hollandia, in March 1944, strafers caught over 300 Japanese aircraft on the ground and destroyed most of them. At Rabaul, they systematically dismantled what had been the most powerful Japanese fortress in the South Pacific. By the time American forces invaded the Philippines in October 1944, the strafers had established complete air superiority over the entire theater. Paul Gunn flew many of those missions himself. Despite his rank, despite his age, despite orders to stay on the ground, he refused to stop flying combat. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. 9 times wounded, 9 times back in the cockpit. In late 1944, Gunn was seriously wounded during a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte. The injuries finally forced him out of combat. He was evacuated to Australia to recover, but by then, the war had turned decisively against Japan, and the moment Gunn had been fighting for was finally at hand. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division broke through Japanese lines and raced toward Manila. General MacArthur had personally ordered the flying column to liberate Santo Tomas internment camp as quickly as possible. The Liberation Force arrived that evening. Colonel Dave Hutchinson, commander of the 308th Bombardment Wing, a special unit that controlled operations in forward areas, went with the Liberation Force specifically to find the Gunn family. He had known Pappy for years. He understood what that family meant to him. Inside the camp, Polly Gunn and her 4 children had survived more than 3 years of captivity. They had endured starvation, disease, abuse, and the constant threat of execution. Japanese guards had become increasingly brutal as the war turned against them. In the final weeks, they had stopped distributing food entirely. Prisoners were dying of malnutrition. The children, Paul and Nathan and Connie and Julie, had grown up in captivity. Paul and Nathan had become experts at smuggling food from Japanese garbage bins to keep their family alive. They had found a hidden radio in the camp attic and provided other prisoners with news of the war's progress, risking execution every time they climbed the stairs. When the American tanks crashed through the gates, Polly Gunn was among the first to greet them. She had not seen her husband in over 3 years. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She only knew that liberation had finally come. The family's ordeal was not quite over. In the days following liberation, Japanese artillery bombarded Santo Tomas repeatedly. Shells fell on buildings full of former prisoners. The Gunn family survived by inches, huddling in makeshift shelters as explosions shook the compound. 2 weeks later, MacArthur visited Santo Tomas and met the Gunn family personally. He put them on an aircraft bound for Australia, where Pappy was recovering from his wounds. After 3 years, 4 months, and 14 days of separation, the Gunn family was finally reunited. Paul Gunn retired from the army in 1948 with the rank of colonel. His discharge was due to physical disability from his many wounds. He returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines, which still operates today as one of the oldest airlines in Asia. On October 11, 1957, Gunn was flying a Beech 18 on a charter flight in the central Philippines when he encountered a sudden storm. The aircraft crashed. There were no survivors. Paul Irving Gunn was 57 years old, just 1 week shy of his 58th birthday. He had once told friends that he would die before he turned 60 with his boots on and the throttles firewalled. That is exactly how he went out. General Kenny wrote a book about him called The Saga of Pappy Gunn. In it, Kenny called him the most audacious and irresponsible officer he had ever known, and also the most effective. Gunn had single-handedly transformed American air power in the Pacific through sheer determination and mechanical genius. Major Edward Larner, who led the first strafer attack at Bismarck Sea, did not survive the war. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after his greatest triumph, Larner was killed in a landing accident at Dobadura. He was performing his trademark low approach, a steep dive followed by a sharp pull-up, but this time his B-25 was overloaded with passengers, baggage, tools, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. When he pulled up, the aircraft stalled, spun, and crashed. 8 men died, including Larner. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters. Captain John Hennebury took over the 90th Bomb Squadron after Larner's death. He led the strafers through the rest of the New Guinea campaign and into the Philippines. After the war, he became a pioneer in jet aviation and eventually rose to the rank of Major General. General George Kenny went on to command all Allied air forces in the Pacific through the end of the war. He stood on the deck of the battleship Missouri on September 2, 1945, watching General MacArthur accept the Japanese surrender. Later, he became the first commander of Strategic Air Command. He died in 1977 at the age of 88. The B-25 Mitchell remained in service long after the war ended. Modified versions flew combat missions in Korea. Others served as training aircraft, reconnaissance platforms, and cargo haulers into the 1960s. A few continued flying as air tankers and sprayers into the 1970s. Nearly 10,000 were built, more than any other American medium bomber. It was the third most produced American bomber overall, behind only the B-24 Liberator and the B-17 Flying Fortress. But the strafer variants hold a special place in aviation history. They represented something unprecedented, a bomber that could fight its way to the target instead of relying on escorts for protection. The concept evolved into dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-26 Invader and eventually the A-10 Thunderbolt, which carries a 30mm Gatling gun that fires nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The philosophical lineage is clear. Give a ground attack aircraft massive forward-firing armament. Let it engage and suppress enemy defenses during the approach. Use that suppression to deliver precision weapons against the target. It is the same formula Pappy Gunn developed in Brisbane in 1942. The modern AC-130 gunship is another descendant of Gunn's creation. It circles above the battlefield with side-firing cannons, howitzers, and Gatling guns, pouring destruction into enemy positions. The technique is different, but the fundamental concept is identical. Combine overwhelming firepower with precision delivery to destroy targets that conventional bombers cannot touch. The lineage runs directly from Pappy Gunn's workshop in Brisbane to the close air support aircraft of today. Every time an American gunship strafes an enemy position, it follows a doctrine that Gunn invented in 1942 with salvaged guns and sheet metal. That is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or procurement programs or factory engineering teams, but through men like Pappy Gunn, who see a problem, find a solution, and do not wait for permission to implement it. North American aviation eventually incorporated Gunn's modifications into production aircraft, but they never credited him publicly. The official histories attribute the strafer concept to engineering analysis and field feedback. Gunn's name appears only in footnotes and personal accounts. He probably would not have cared. He did not modify the B-25 for recognition or promotion. He did it to kill Japanese and rescue his family. Everything else was incidental. In the end, 18 machine guns on one aircraft changed the Pacific War. They gave American pilots a weapon that could sweep enemy ships from the sea and enemy aircraft from the skies. They proved that bombers could do more than drop bombs from altitude. They showed that imagination and determination could overcome any obstacle. And they brought one man's family home. That is the story of the B-25 strafer. It began with a father's desperation and ended with a transformation of American air power. In between were moments of genius, tragedy, and triumph that deserve to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.